About 80 years ago, a woman took her dog for a walk on this beach. In doing so, she set in motion a chain of events that would lead her to the front pages of newspapers around the world and also get her an appointment with the hangman's noose. This is the story of Dorothy O'Grady, possibly one of the strangest spies you've ever heard of. Now, thanks to Hollywood, we all know what a spy looks like and what they do. They've got 6 passports, they live a globe-trotting, jet-setting lifestyle, they're living in the poshest hotels and travelling the world, and they're all gloriously attractive, like this lady. But if you spoke to a real spy, they tell you that spies aren't like that. The last thing you want to do is look like this lady and stand out by living a ritzy lifestyle. No, a proper spy is an ordinary person, a seaside landlady, your next door neighbour, somebody who looks like this. And in fact, this is Dorothy. Dorothy was so nondescript, even her neighbours didn't know what her name was. And that's what you want if you're a spy. You don't want to stand out, you don't want people saying, hey, that's a spy. In fact, the way the spy catchers tell spies is that they are perfectly ordinary, they're too ordinary. Dorothy fits into that category, but, well, as we'll see, she's not exactly a typical spy. So what did she do on this beach that caused the problem? As I said, she walked her dog. Not normally a problem, but this was 1940 and things were a little bit different back then. If you can imagine, you're living your life quite happily in 1939 and then suddenly something happens and they bring in a whole set of rules, says you can't turn the light on or walk on the beach. That's what happened to Dorothy. I don't know if you remember, but 1939 we had a little bit of a phony war going on across the channel over there. Some little shouty guy with a dodgy moustache and a silly haircut was stamping around, threatening to invade countries and generally making a nuisance of himself. Now over here in Britain we knew that some silly little guy with funny haircut isn't going to be invading France. I mean, we've been fighting France for years and we've got nowhere, so what chance does he stand? Then 1940 came along and suddenly France surrenders. Little shouty guy is just over there, sitting on Jersey, Barocula's trained on the south coast, and Sandown, where Dorothy lives, is frontline central. Yeah, suddenly things got a bit more serious, and overnight we got, well, defences went up all over the place. Where I'm standing now is directly below a machine gun nest, and this is where Dorothy met up with the local constabulary, or in fact, I think they were army. And you don't want to mess with the army. So, what happened with Dorothy when she met the army? Well, of course, she had an excuse. Her excuse was always that her dog Rob, a black retriever, used to run away, and of course she had to chase after it into the prohibited zone to rescue the poor little thing, didn't she? Dorothy's method of rescuing Bob was, well, not exactly normal. Her method was, well, I'll show you. So Dorothy's method of rescuing Bob was to sit herself down in a nice comfy spot and start eating a sandwich. As you can imagine, the soldiers didn't really see this as a valid excuse to be in a military defence zone. First couple of times they let her off. Then on the third attempt, their patience ran out. I don't know whether there was a crackdown or just she was getting annoying, but either way, they arrested her. She was taken to Bembridge, which is 3 miles that away, and she was charged with trespassing on the beach and annoying the soldiers, basically, and that's where it would have ended. Now, what she could have done is she could have turned up to court in Ryde the following week, as she was told to, and she would have been given a slap on the wrist, told don't do it again, maybe a small fine. That would have been the end of it. But unfortunately, Dorothy chose to do something else. She got on a bus, headed off in the opposite direction, went to Totland, which is about 20 miles that way, and went on the run. Now, suddenly, she looks a lot more suspicious. I mean, she might be just a plain old seaside landlady, but they don't go on the run when they're arrested for trivial offences. So things got a bit more serious. MI5 got involved, and a full-scale manhunt was launched. And for the next 2 weeks, the police and army were scouring the island looking for Dorothy. You'd think that being on the run, Dorothy would lay low. But in fact, while she was at Totland using her alias of Pamela Ireland, she still carried on making maps, wandering around through the woods and generally spying on local installations. She possibly even cut some telephone wires leading up to the Needles, and definitely made a big mistake when she tried to bribe some Boy Scouts. She'd asked them to get information. What they actually did was just buy some sweets and then pop off to the police station to say, hey, we found a spy. So it's not surprising that within 2 weeks she was captured at a guest house in Totland, where she was reportedly caught trying to flush papers down the toilet. Maybe she was having second thoughts, maybe she just read it in a book that that's what you're supposed to do. Either way, that's what she was caught doing. She was then arrested, bundled up in a car by MI5 and taken off to be interrogated. Now, the press made a big thing of the fact that she tried to take suicide pills when she was in that car. And the pills she took were prescription drugs for what they'd usually used for stuffy noses and travel sickness. So realistically, even if she'd been allowed to take the whole bottle, she just would have had a pleasant journey and a nice clean nose. Now, by this point, Dorothy had really settled into a persona of super spy. Whether she was actually a spy or not is open to debate, but she definitely made a good impression, and MI5 left utterly convinced that she was guilty of espionage. So, before she was facing a couple of trivial charges in Ryde, suddenly she had a court date in Winchester. She annoyed MI5, and MI5 do things in a much more serious way. The charges at Winchester became that she did feloniously enter on the foreshore and did act in a manner likely to prevent or interfere with the performance of the duties of HM forces. So, the right charges again. And that was contrary to Regulation 16A of the Defence General Regulations 1939. She is further charged that she did, with intent to aid the enemy, unlawfully carry out an act that was designed or likely to impede the nation's naval, military or air operations. And that's contrary to Section 1 of the Treachery Acts. This is one of the break this and you hang ones, so not a good one to break. And that she did commit by sabotage, cutting a telephone wire.
This act being likely to assist the enemy, that she unlawfully conspired with another unknown to commit said act, and that she fought a military safeguard, and that for purposes for the state she did approach in place, and that she did make a plan of potential use to the enemy, and finally that she was in possession of a document with information purporting to relate to the nation's defences.
All contrary to the Official Secrets Act 1911. As you can imagine, she wasn't going to be getting a slap on the wrist for this one. But as long as she had a good defence, she should be able to get off. I mean, after all, what had she actually done? She'd wandered around on a beach, annoyed a couple of soldiers, and played at being a spy. So yeah, she hadn't really done all that much, so with a good defence, she was going to get off, right? Well, unfortunately not. Yeah, Dorothy's defence, unfortunately, consisted of a barrister refusing to allow her to speak, not presenting any evidence, and standing up in court and basically announcing, "My client is an idiot, please let her off." The jury, not surprisingly, came back very quickly. So quickly, in fact, that the press were still in the pub and were caught by surprise. You won't be surprised to hear that the verdict was guilty on all counts. Now, the judge had no choice. She'd broken the Treachery Act. There was only one possible sentence on that, and that was to hang. Now, this annoyed Dorothy. Not for the reasons you'd think, though. She was annoyed because she thought spies were shot. She was also further annoyed because they told her she would have to wear a blindfold, and to quote her, she says, "What is the good of being hanged if I can't see what's happening?" I should say Dorothy was a very strange lady. So yeah, there we have it. Dorothy is sentenced to hang. She didn't have very long to mount any sort of appeal. So things had to get underway very quickly. And this is where the Luftwaffe intervened and came to her aid by bombing her defence barrister's chambers, destroying evidence. Dorothy wasn't really having the best year. Still, they persevered and somehow they managed to get her off. They quashed the capital charges, but the others of annoying the soldiers and just being a general nuisance stayed, so she got sentenced to 14 years in prison. She was bundled off in a van back to Aylesbury, and that's where she stayed, apart from a very short trip to Holloway, for the next 10 years, being released in 1950 due to her husband's ailing health. So why did she skip her appointment in Ryde, especially given the consequences? Well, her excuse, and she gave many over the years, but the main ones were that the bus was going to get her there either an hour early or an hour late. And so instead she hopped on a different one and went to Totland. A little bit odd, except anybody who knows the buses around here knows that that's actually 3 buses she would have had to go on to get to Totland. But hey, this is Dorothy we're talking about. She, as we will see, doesn't exactly tell the truth much. Her other excuse was that she was worried that things might come out in courts that she didn't want her husband to see and didn't want her husband to find out about. What things? Exactly, what possibly could come out about a seaside landlady that she wouldn't want her husband to know? She'd been fiddling the tea money? She'd had an affair with one of the guests? Possibly. But no, Dorothy was an upright citizen. She didn't do any of that, no. Our Dorothy was a prostitute. Not anymore. No. Back in her youth. Dorothy was born in 1897, October, and she was adopted. She had a fairy tale upbringing. She was adopted at birth, she had a wicked stepmother, and yeah, the whole lot. Which I have to say is nowhere near as much fun in real life as it looks in Hollywood. So yeah, Dorothy had this not exactly pleasant fairy tale upbringing. She went to a Catholic school, didn't get on very well. Mother died when she was 11, and by the time she was 13, she'd left home and was living in an institution that trained young girls for domestic service. It was basically a prison for teenagers. Yeah. By January of 1918, she'd been arrested for fraud. Things pretty much went downhill from there. By 1925, she was arrested in Soho one night for soliciting, and this is where things really took a turn. She claims she was out looking for medicine for her dog and asking strangers where she might find an all-night chemist. The police didn't believe her. They locked her up for soliciting, which was the standard thing to do. By the time she was released a couple of days later, the dog had died. She never forgave the authorities for that. And this is possibly the reason she had such a mistrust of them, and when the regulations came in 1940, why she went out of her way to break them. Authority had killed her dog as far as she was concerned, and she wanted revenge. Now things went from bad to worse for Dorothy in the 1920s. She was arrested for prostitution twice more. Interestingly, the last time 3 weeks before her wedding. Now I don't know what your maths is like, but if you get arrested and given a 3-week sentence 3 weeks before your wedding day, then that means that you're not going to be released until your wedding morning. And I really don't see how Dorothy's husband didn't notice something was a little bit odd about that. Maybe he just thought she was a very private person, I don't know. Or maybe she was just a really, really good liar. We do know she did tell a lot of lies. She liked telling stories, did Dorothy. So, Dorothy, convicted prostitute, she claimed she was trying to hide that. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. However, she seems to have settled down with her husband Victor. When he retired, they moved to Sandown on the Isle of Wight, where they opened up a guest house on the Broadway, coincidentally right opposite the local army barracks. Now, this has been used as an excuse to justify some of the claims that she really was a spy. Because after all, why would she move there if not? Well, the answer was it was cheap, I think. Because even the Nazi war machine hadn't thought of sending spies over until 1938. She moved there in 1936. So she was way ahead of the time. So, as I say, she settled down in the guest house. Things went very well for the next few years. Then the war came along, little shouty man started making trouble, and regulations came in, she gets arrested, and we have her there in prison. And while she's there, it's rumoured that another spy was put in with her to try and elicit information. The spy concerned was somebody called Vera Eriksson. You might find her familiar. She's the lady I showed you earlier on. Now, Vera was more of a James Bond spy. She did spend most of her life going around very high-class hotels, spending lots of money, getting drunk, using drugs, and spied for the Russians, the Germans, and it's rumoured possibly even the British. So yeah, this is one heavy-duty spy. Now, I've looked at her record and they don't really talk about her talking to Dorothy, but we have one other little detail. Our civil service is very efficient, sometimes too efficient. In this case, they managed to lose Dorothy's file. So all of her court case, all of her court papers, all of the MI5 files, everything has disappeared. So our Dorothy is a bit of a mystery. So whereas I know everything at all about what Vera did, all I know about Dorothy is that she was a prostitute and went to prison. And that's it. So, what happened next? Dorothy goes to prison. She gets let out in 1950 to look after her husband. And you'd think things would quieten down, but our Dorothy likes to be the centre of attention. So rather than settling down and going somewhere else where people didn't know her, she moved straight back to Sandown. That didn't go down well. There are stories of people refusing to serve her in shops, people crossing the road to avoid seeing her, because obviously a spy in your midst is not something you want. Even though it was several years after the war, people still remembered. And so she was not popular. Gradually, of course, the publicity died down and things quietened. So Dorothy rang the papers and she got on the news. And every few years she would contrive another news story that put her in the headlines or on the television. She just loved being the centre of attention, and she would tell her story to anybody and everybody who would listen. Now, if that doesn't sound like a spy, you're probably right. I mean, what spy is going to make that much fuss? Though, of course, if you think about it, a spy who everybody knows is a spy isn't going to need to be secretive about it. I mean, why would they? Look at James Bond. How on earth could anybody who blows up cars for a living possibly go under the radar and not be noticed? No. So it's possible that she really was a super intelligent spy. Her prison records show that they did intelligence tests on her, and she came out pretty much off the scale. They classed her as highly intelligent, a skilled liar, and highly manipulative. She was very good at saying what people wanted to hear. Now, whether she was very good at fiddling intelligence tests and actually wasn't intelligent, I don't know. But she had to be clever enough to do that, so let's give her the benefit of the doubt. So that's where the story ends. Except it doesn't, because, as I said, she kept popping up on the news. Eventually she had to move into a retirement home in Lake, but she still kept on telling her stories and still kept on appearing in the papers. Even after she died, the local MP decided to try and clear her name. He hired a journalist. He looked at her records, which basically only showed the prosecution case, and concluded, like the court did, that she was totally and utterly guilty. And he made a big story that he published saying exactly how guilty she was, and pointing out all the strange things she did while in prison with light bulbs and pins, and how she was a masochist and definitely a spy and super intelligent, and how she'd fooled everyone. So our MP's attempt to clear her name backfired quite badly. But that was the end of it. Until 1992, when Maureen Lipman played her in a radio play, and 2000, when she popped up in the paper again, and 2018, when she appeared in a radio documentary. In fact, she keeps popping up. So I think Dorothy is going to be around for some time to come. She wouldn't even let being dead stop her. So, was Dorothy really a super spy, super intelligent? Or was she, as she always claimed, just an ordinary lady who was bored and just did it all for a bit of a giggle? Well, only Dorothy knows for sure, and she definitely was never going to be telling the truth on that one.